She stood in the middle of the grand ballroom, while everyone pretended not to see her. The candlelight caught the crystals dripping from the chandeliers, scattering light across silk gowns and glittering jewels. Laughter rippled through the crowd like water over stones. Music swelled from the quartet in the corner, and Alara Vance, Duchess of Blackwood, stood completely alone. Her husband had not looked at her once all evening. She watched him now from across the room. Aldrich Vance, the Duke of Blackwood, tall and imposing in his dark evening coat, his posture perfect, his expression unreadable. He stood with his customary group of advisors and political allies, discussing matters that mattered, matters that never included her. 3 years of marriage, 3 years of standing in corners while he lived his life as though she did not exist. Alara pressed her hand against the silk of her gown. She had worn the deep blue because he had once mentioned, years ago, that the color reminded him of the sea at midnight. She had thought perhaps he might notice. Perhaps he might say something. Anything. He had not. A footman passed with a tray of champagne. Alara took a glass she did not want, simply to have something to do with her hands. The bubbles rose and burst, rose and burst. A tiny, silent destruction that no one noticed. "She looks rather pathetic tonight, doesn't she?" The voice drifted from somewhere behind her. Two women, their heads bent together, their fans fluttering like the wings of trapped birds. 3 years and not even a child. Small wonder he spends so much time away. My cousin says he never even visits her chambers. Heat flooded Alara's cheeks. She should have been accustomed to the whispers by now. 3 years of them. 3 years of pitying glances and cruel speculation. But the sting never quite faded. She turned away from the voices, moving toward the terrace doors. The music followed her, a waltz now, something achingly romantic that made her chest feel hollow. Couples moved together across the dance floor, hands clasped, eyes meeting, the promise of love written in every step. Her husband had never danced with her, not even at their wedding. The terrace was cold when she stepped outside. Late autumn had stripped the gardens bare, leaving skeletal trees that reached toward the stars like supplicants begging for mercy. Alara wrapped her arms around herself and breathed in the sharp, clean air. She had loved him once, before the wedding, before she understood what it meant to be a duchess in name only. She had been 18 when her father told her of the arrangement, a political alliance he had called it. The Vance family needed her family's connections in the north. Her family needed the Vance family's influence at court. A transaction, nothing more. But Alara had been foolish. She had seen Aldrich Vance at a dinner party 6 months before the contracts were signed, and she had fallen in love with the quiet, serious man who had looked at her across the table with such intensity that she had forgotten how to breathe. He had not looked at her that way since their wedding night. On their wedding night, he had come to her chambers, stood in the doorway, and told her that the marriage was one of duty, that he would respect her, that he would provide for her, that he would never shame her. But he would never love her either. Alara had cried herself to sleep that night, her wedding dress still pooled around her on the bed, the pearls her mother had given her cold against her throat. 3 years later, nothing had changed. The terrace door opened behind her. Alara did not turn around. She knew the sound of his footsteps, the particular weight of his presence. She had spent 3 years learning every detail of a man who barely acknowledged her existence. "Duchess." His voice was low and measured. It always was. Aldrich Vance never raised his voice, never showed emotion, never let anyone see what lay beneath the careful mask he wore. "Your Grace," she did not turn around. "You have been standing out here for some time. People will talk." Something inside Alara snapped. It was a small thing, a tiny fracture in the wall she had built around her heart, but it was enough. "People already talk," she said quietly. "They talk whether I stand in the ballroom or on the terrace. They talk whether I smile or weep. They talk because my husband has made me invisible, and there is nothing more entertaining than an invisible duchess. Silence, long and taut as a wire. Ilara finally turned to face him. The moonlight caught the sharp planes of his face, the strong line of his jaw, the dark eyes that had haunted her dreams since she was 18 years old. He was beautiful in the way a winter landscape was beautiful. Cold, distant, untouchable. "I did not realize," he said slowly, "that you were unhappy." The fracture widened, became a crack, became something that might shatter entirely. "Then you have not been paying attention," Ilara said. She walked past him, back into the ballroom, back into the noise and the light and the crowd that pretended she did not exist. Her heart pounded against her ribs, her hands trembled. She had never spoken to him that way before. She had always been dutiful, always been silent, always been grateful for whatever scraps of attention he chose to give her. Not anymore. Something had changed tonight, something fundamental. She could feel it in her bones. The invisible Duchess was tired of being invisible. The morning after the ball, Ilara made a decision. She stood in her private sitting room, a small but elegant space overlooking the eastern gardens. Morning light poured through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air. On her desk lay a piece of paper, blank and waiting. For 3 years, she had devoted herself to the role of Duchess. She had managed the household with meticulous care. She had hosted dinners and attended functions. She had smiled until her face ached and made pleasant conversation with people who whispered about her behind their fans. She had done everything expected of her, everything demanded of her. And it had earned her nothing. So she would do something for herself instead. Ilara dipped her quill in ink and began to write. Not a letter to her husband, not a plea for attention or affection. She was done with that. Instead, she wrote to the one person who had ever made her feel seen. Her Aunt Marguerite lived in a small coastal village 3 days' journey from Blackwood Manor. She was her mother's sister, a widow with no children of her own, and the only person in the world who had ever told Ilara that she deserved to be loved. The letter was simple. Ilara asked if she might visit. She did not explain why. She did not mention her husband or her marriage or the hollow ache that had taken up permanent residence in her chest. She simply asked if she might come. The reply arrived 4 days later. "Come at once. I have been waiting for you." Ilara packed a single trunk. She did not tell her husband she was leaving. She simply informed the housekeeper that she would be away for a fortnight, perhaps longer, and arranged for a carriage to take her to the coast. She was in the entrance hall, pulling on her gloves, when Aldrich appeared at the top of the staircase. "Where are you going?" His voice echoed in the marble space. Ilara looked up at him, at the confusion flickering beneath his carefully controlled expression, and felt something that surprised her. Indifference. It was not anger, not sadness, not the desperate longing she had carried for so long. It was simply the quiet, steady knowledge that his opinion no longer mattered to her. "I am visiting my aunt," she said, "in Dorset." "For how long?" "I do not know." He descended the stairs slowly, his boots clicking against the marble. When he reached the bottom, he stood before her, close enough that she could smell the sandalwood soap he used, close enough that she could see the tiny scar above his left eyebrow, the one she had wondered about for years but never had the courage to ask about. "You did not mention this," he said. "No," Ilara agreed, "I did not." Something flickered in his dark eyes, something that might have been surprise, or concern, or perhaps she was imagining it. She had spent so long imagining emotions in him that simply were not there. "Will you return?" he asked. Ilara tilted her head, studying him. "That is an interesting question, Your Grace. Are you asking if I plan to abandon my duties? Rest assured, I would never embarrass you in such a way. I will return when I am ready." "When you are ready," he repeated. "Yes, She pulled on her second glove, smoothing the leather over her fingers. I have spent 3 years waiting for things to change. I am done waiting. She walked out the door before he could respond. The carriage was waiting in the drive, the horses stamping impatiently in the cold morning air. Alara climbed inside, settled into the velvet seat, and closed her eyes as the vehicle lurched into motion. She did not look back at the manor. She did not look back at her husband. She was done looking back. Aunt Marguerite lived in a cottage by the sea, a small white building with blue shutters and a garden that had gone wild with roses. The air smelled of salt and something sweet, something green, something that felt like freedom. When Alara stepped out of the carriage, her aunt was already standing in the doorway. Marguerite was 63 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a loose knot and eyes that missed nothing. She wore a simple gray dress and no jewelry, and she opened her arms without a word. Alara fell into them and wept. She wept for the girl she had been at 18, so full of hope. She wept for the woman she had become, so hollowed out by disappointment. She wept for the marriage that had never been a marriage, the love that had only ever existed on one side. Marguerite held her without speaking, stroking her hair the way she had when Alara was a child, when her mother died and the world had seemed to end. "Come inside," Marguerite said finally. "I have tea." The cottage was small and cluttered and warm. Books were stacked on every surface. Seashells lined the windowsills. A fire crackled in the hearth, and a gray cat dozed on the rug before it. Alara sat at the kitchen table while her aunt made tea. The familiarity of it, the simple domestic ritual, loosened something in her chest. "Tell me," Marguerite said, setting a cup before her. So Alara told her, all of it, the 3 years of silence, the 3 years of loneliness, the 3 years of loving a man who had made it clear from the very first night that her love was not wanted. When she finished, Marguerite was quiet for a long moment. "Your mother," she said finally, "made a similar marriage. Did you know that?" Alara looked up, startled. "My parents loved each other." "Eventually," Marguerite said, "but not at first. Your father was cold when they married, distant. He had loved someone else, a girl who died of fever before he met your mother. He married because he had to, not because he wanted to. And your mother spent years believing she would never be more than a replacement for a ghost." "But they were happy," Alara said. "I remember them being happy." "They were," Marguerite agreed. "Because your mother stopped waiting for your father to love her. She stopped arranging her life around his attention. She built her own world, found her own purpose, became a woman who did not need his affection to feel whole. And that was when he finally saw her." Alara stared at her tea. The leaves had settled at the bottom of the cup, forming patterns she could not read. "I do not know how to do that," she whispered. "Of course you do," Marguerite said. "You simply have not let yourself try." The days at the cottage passed slowly and sweetly. Alara woke each morning to the sound of gulls crying over the water. She walked along the cliffs, her hair loose in the wind, her lungs filling with salt air. She helped her aunt in the garden, pulling weeds and planting bulbs for the spring. She read books that had nothing to do with household management or social etiquette. She cooked simple meals and ate them while watching the sun set over the sea. She did not think about Aldrich. Or rather, she tried not to think about him. He crept into her thoughts anyway, unbidden and unwelcome. She wondered what he was doing, whether he had noticed her absence, whether he cared. But she did not let herself dwell on those questions. They were old questions, worn smooth by years of repetition. They had never brought her anything but pain. On the 5th day, a letter arrived. Alara recognized the handwriting immediately. Strong, precise, controlled, Aldrich's hand. She carried the letter to the cliffs and sat on the grass overlooking the water before she opened it. "Duchess, the household is quiet without you. I find myself listening for your footsteps in the hall. The library has never seemed so empty. I do not know what I have done to drive you away. I do not know if you will tell me, but I find that I want to know. I find that I want to understand. When you return, I would like to speak with you, properly, as we have not spoken since our wedding night. Please come home soon. Your servant, Aldrich. Alara read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and tucked it into her pocket. Something had shifted. She could feel it. The ground beneath her feet was no longer quite as solid as it had been. But she was not ready to go home, not yet. She wrote a brief reply that evening, polite, dutiful, the kind of letter the Duchess of Blackwood was expected to write. She told him she was well, that she would return when her visit concluded, that she hoped he was taking care of himself. She did not mention the way her heart had raced when she read his words. She did not mention the hope that had flickered in her chest, fragile as a candle flame in a storm. She was done hopping, she was done waiting. But perhaps she was not quite as done as she wanted to be. In the second week of her visit, Alara met a man. His name was Thomas Hayward, and he was the physician in the village. He was 30 years old, with kind brown eyes and hands that were gentle when they examined his patients. He had come to the cottage to check on Marguerite's rheumatism, which flared up whenever the weather turned cold. Alara was in the garden when he arrived. She was on her knees in the dirt, her sleeves pushed up to her elbows, her face flushed from exertion. She looked nothing like a duchess. She looked like a woman who had finally stopped caring what anyone thought of her. "Forgive me," Thomas said, pausing at the garden gate. "I did not mean to intrude. I am looking for Mrs. Ashford." "My aunt," Alara said, rising and brushing dirt from her skirt. "She is inside. I will take you to her." She led him into the cottage, where Marguerite was settled in her chair by the fire. Thomas examined her with careful attention, asking questions about her pain, suggesting remedies, listening to her answers with genuine interest. Alara watched him from the doorway. There was something about him that reminded her of her father, a steadiness, a quiet warmth, the kind of presence that made people feel safe. When he finished his examination, Marguerite insisted he stay for tea. He accepted with a smile, and the 3 of them sat in the small sitting room while the fire crackled and the cat purred on the windowsill. Thomas asked Alara about herself, not about her title or her husband or her position in society. He asked about her interests, her thoughts, her opinions. He asked as though her answers mattered. It had been so long since anyone had asked her such questions that she almost did not know how to respond. She told him about the books she had been reading, about her walks along the cliffs, about the garden she was helping her aunt restore. Small things, ordinary things, but they felt extraordinary when spoken aloud to someone who actually listened. When Thomas left, he bowed over her hand with old-fashioned courtesy. "It was a pleasure to meet you, Your Grace," he said. "I hope I will see you again before you return to Blackwood." After he was gone, Marguerite looked at Alara with knowing eyes. "He is a good man," she said. "Yes," Alara agreed, "he seems to be. He looked at you the way a man looks at a woman he finds interesting." Alara felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Aunt Marguerite, I am a married woman." "I am aware," Marguerite said dryly. "But your husband is not here, and that young physician looked at you more warmly in one afternoon than the Duke of Blackwood has looked at you in 3 years. I am simply making an observation." Alara said nothing, but that night, lying in her narrow bed with the sound of the sea in her ears, she thought about Thomas Hayward's kind brown eyes. And she thought about her husband's letter, still tucked in her pocket. And she did not know what to feel. Thomas Hayward began to visit regularly. He came under the pretense of checking on Marguerite's health, but it was clear to everyone that his interest lay elsewhere. He brought Alara small gifts, a book of poetry he thought she might enjoy, a shell he had found on the beach, its interior shimmering with mother-of-pearl, a posy of late-blooming flowers from his own garden. He never spoke of her husband. He never asked when she was returning to Blackwood. He simply treated her as though she were a woman worth knowing, worth listening to, worth spending time with. And Alara found herself looking forward to his visits. It was not love, she knew that. Her heart was still too bruised, too battered, too entangled with the man she had married. But it was something, a reminder that she was more than the invisible Duchess, a reminder that she could be seen. One afternoon, Thomas took her walking along the cliffs. The wind was sharp and cold, and the sea churned gray below them. Gulls wheeled overhead, their cries thin and plaintive. "Do you miss it?" Thomas asked. "Your life at Blackwood?" Alara considered the question. "I miss the familiarity of it," she said finally. "I miss knowing my place in the world, even if that place was not a happy one. There is a strange comfort in the familiar, even when the familiar is painful." "That sounds very lonely," Thomas said quietly. "It was," Alara said. "It is." They walked in silence for a while. Then Thomas stopped and turned to face her. The wind whipped his brown hair across his forehead, and his eyes were very serious. "Your Grace," he said, "Alara, if you were not married, if your circumstances were different, I would court you. I want you to know that. Not because I expect anything from you, but because I think you deserve to know that you are the kind of woman a man would be proud to love." Alara's throat tightened. "Thomas, you do not need to say anything," he said quickly. "I know you are married. I know your life is elsewhere. I am not asking you to change anything. I simply wanted you to know." She nodded, unable to speak. That evening she wrote another letter to Aldrich. Not a dutiful letter this time, an honest one. "I have spent 3 years believing I was not worthy of love. I have spent 3 years believing there was something wrong with me, something lacking, something that made me impossible to care for. A man told me today that I am the kind of woman a man would be proud to love. And I realized that I have been waiting for you to say those words since the night we married. I am not waiting anymore. I will return to Blackwood in a fortnight. We have much to discuss. Alara." She sent the letter before she could change her mind. Aldrich Vance received his wife's letter at midnight. He was in his study, as he always was at midnight. The fire had burned low, and a single candle flickered on his desk. He had been staring at estate accounts without seeing them, his mind elsewhere. His mind had been elsewhere for weeks now. Since the night of the ball. Since the moment his wife had looked at him with ice in her eyes and told him that people talked because he had made her invisible. He had not known. That was the terrible truth of it. He had not known that she was unhappy. He had not known that she felt unseen. He had not known anything about the woman he had married except that she was dutiful and graceful and quiet. He had never asked. He had been so consumed by his own grief, his own anger, his own bitter disappointment at the hand fate had dealt him, that he had never once considered what hand fate had dealt her. Aldrich set the letter down on his desk and pressed his palms against his eyes. He had not wanted this marriage. That was the root of it. He had loved someone else once, a girl named Catherine, with golden hair and a laugh that sounded like bells. She had died of scarlet fever 2 weeks before their wedding, and Aldrich had buried his heart with her. When his father told him 3 years later that he would marry Alara Vance for the sake of the family's political alliances, Aldrich had felt nothing. He had gone through the motions, the engagement, the wedding night when he had stood in her doorway and told her that he would never love her. He had been cruel. He had not meant to be cruel, but that was what it had been. Cruelty disguised as honesty, cruelty disguised as duty. And Alara had borne it. For 3 years she had borne it. She had managed his household, entertained his guests, smiled at his associates. She had done everything asked of her and more, and he had never once thanked her, never once acknowledged her efforts, never once looked at her as anything other than an obligation he had been forced to accept. He had been a fool. He was still a fool, but he was a fool who was beginning to understand the cost of his foolishness. The letter lay on his desk, her words burning into his mind. A man told me today that I am the kind of woman a man would be proud to love. Who was this man? What had he said to her? What had he offered her? Jealousy rose in Aldrich's chest, hot and sharp and unfamiliar. He had never been jealous before. He had never cared enough about anyone to feel jealous. But he cared now. He cared that his wife was miles away, in a cottage by the sea, receiving compliments from strange men. He cared that she had stopped waiting for him. He cared that she was no longer the invisible woman who followed him through his life like a shadow. He wanted her back. He wanted her back, and he did not know how to ask for her. Aldrich arrived in Dorset on a grey afternoon, 3 days after receiving Ilara's letter. He had not planned to come. He had told himself that he would wait for her return, that he would speak with her then, that there was no need for dramatic gestures. But the days had crawled past with agonizing slowness, and the silence of Blackwood Manor had become unbearable, and he had found himself ordering his horse to be saddled before he could talk himself out of it. The village was small and quiet, the kind of place where strangers were noticed immediately. Aldrich felt eyes on him as he rode down the main street, past the bakery and the blacksmith and the tiny stone church. He was a duke, dressed in fine clothes, mounted on a horse worth more than most of these people would earn in a lifetime. He did not belong here. But Ilara did. He could feel it. She belonged in this quiet place by the sea, where the air was clean and the people were kind and no one whispered behind her back. He found the cottage easily enough. It was exactly as the housekeeper had described it: small, white, blue shutters, a garden gone wild with roses. And in the garden, on her knees in the dirt, was his wife. Aldrich dismounted and stood at the gate watching her. She had not noticed him yet. She was pulling weeds with focused determination, her sleeves pushed up, her hair escaping from its pins. There was dirt on her cheek and a smudge of green on her forehead. She looked nothing like a duchess. She looked beautiful. He had never told her that. In 3 years of marriage, he had never once told her that she was beautiful. Ilara. She looked up startled. For a moment her face was open and unguarded, and he saw something there that made his chest ache. Surprise, confusion, and beneath it, a wariness that had never been there before. Aldrich, she rose slowly, brushing her hands on her skirt. What are you doing here? I received your letter. I did not expect you to come. I know. He opened the gate and stepped into the garden. The roses brushed against his coat, releasing their sweet, heavy scent. But I could not wait for you to return. I needed to see you. She studied him with those clear gray eyes. Why? The question was simple. It should have been easy to answer. But Aldrich found that the words were stuck in his throat, tangled with years of silence and regret. Because I have been a fool, he said finally. Because I have treated you abominably. Because you deserve better than a husband who made you feel invisible. Ilara's expression did not change. And you rode 3 days to tell me this. I rode 3 days to ask you to come home. I told you I would return in a fortnight. I know, but I could not wait. He took a step closer to her. Ilara, I know I have no right to ask anything of you. I know I have given you nothing but coldness and distance. But I am asking anyway. Please come home. Please give me a chance to make things right. She was silent for a long moment. The wind stirred her hair, and the gulls cried over the sea, and Aldrich felt his heart pounding in his chest like a boy's. Who is he? He asked suddenly. Who is who? The man who told you that you were the kind of woman a man would be proud to love. Ilara's eyes widened slightly, then something flickered in them, something that might have been satisfaction. You are jealous. Yes, Aldrich said, and the admission felt like a wound opening. I am jealous. I am jealous, and I am afraid, and I am ashamed of everything I have done and everything I have failed to do. I have no right to feel any of these things, but I feel them anyway. I feel them because I am only now beginning to understand what I am in danger of losing." "What are you in danger of losing?" Ilara asked quietly. "You," he said. "I am in danger of losing you, and I do not think I could bear it." The silence stretched between them, taut and trembling. Then Ilara did something that surprised him. She laughed. It was not a mocking laugh. It was the laugh of someone who has been holding their breath for a very long time and has finally remembered how to exhale. "The physician," she said. "His name is Thomas Hayward. He is the village doctor. He has been kind to me and he told me that I deserve to be loved. That is all. There is nothing between us. There never could be." Relief flooded through Aldrich, so intense that it left him lightheaded. "I see." "Do you?" Ilara looked at him with those steady gray eyes. "Do you understand that I did not come here to find another man? I came here to find myself. I came here because I had spent 3 years disappearing, and I was afraid that if I stayed any longer, there would be nothing left of me at all." "Ilara." "I loved you," she said, and her voice broke on the words. "From the moment I saw you at that dinner party before our engagement was even arranged. I loved you with everything I had, and you told me on our wedding night that you would never love me back. Do you know what that did to me? Do you have any idea?" Aldrich felt his own eyes sting. "I am sorry," he said. "I am so sorry. I was grieving someone else and I took that grief out on you, and it was the cruelest thing I have ever done." "Who was she?" Ilara asked. "The woman you loved before me." "Her name was Catherine. She died of scarlet fever 2 weeks before we were to be married. I thought I would never recover. I thought my heart had died with her. And so when my father arranged our marriage, I told myself that I was being honest by warning you not to expect love from me. But it was not honesty. It was cowardice. I was afraid to feel anything for anyone because feeling meant the possibility of loss." "And now," Ilara whispered, "now I am more afraid of losing you than I ever was of losing her." The words hung in the air between them. Ilara stared at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You cannot expect me to believe you," she said. "Not after 3 years. I do not expect you to believe me. I expect you to let me prove it." "How?" "Come home," he said. "Let me try. Let me show you that I can be the husband you deserve. And if after a year you still do not believe me, I will give you whatever freedom you wish. A separate household, an annulment, whatever you need to be happy. I will not keep you trapped in a marriage that brings you nothing but pain." Ilara looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked past him, at the cottage, at the sea, at the wild garden that had become her sanctuary. "I will come home," she said finally, "but not because you asked me to, because I am ready to, because I have found something here that I thought I had lost forever." "What is that?" "Myself," she said. "I found myself, and I am not going to lose her again." They returned to Blackwood together. The journey took 3 days, and they spent most of it in silence. But it was a different silence than the one that had stretched between them for 3 years. It was not the silence of distance. It was the silence of two people learning how to be near each other. When they arrived at Blackwood Manor, the staff was waiting to greet them. Ilara walked through the familiar halls, and for the first time she felt as though she belonged there, not as an invisible shadow but as the mistress of the house, as a woman who had a right to be there. Aldrich gave her space. He did not crowd her or demand her attention. He simply made himself available. He ate meals with her. He walked with her in the gardens. He asked her questions about her day and listened to her answers. It was awkward at first. They were strangers who had been married for 3 years, learning each other for the first time. But slowly, gradually, the awkwardness began to fade. One evening, a fortnight after their return, Aldrich found her in the library. She was sitting by the fire, reading a book of poetry that Thomas Hayward had given her. She had not intended to keep it, but the poems were beautiful, and they reminded her of the sea. "What are you reading?" Aldrich asked, settling into the chair across from her. Poetry, she held up the book, a gift from the physician. Aldrich's jaw tightened slightly, but he said nothing. He was kind to me, Alara said. He saw me when I felt invisible. I will always be grateful to him for that, but I am not in love with him. I never was. I know, Aldrich said quietly. I trust you. Those 3 words, so simple and so unexpected, made Alara's heart catch in her chest. You do. I do. I have no reason to. I have given you no reason to trust me, but I trust you. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his dark eyes earnest. Alara, I know I have no right to ask this, but I am going to ask anyway. Will you let me court you? She blinked. Court me. We are already married. I know, but we have never been properly courted. We have never had the chance to fall in love the way other couples do. I want to give you that. I want to take you to dinners and walk with you in the gardens and bring you flowers. I want to be the man you deserve, not the man I have been. Alara felt tears prick her eyes. Aldrich. I do not expect you to fall in love with me, he said. I only ask that you let me try to earn your love. That is all. She set the book aside and rose from her chair. Then she crossed the space between them and took his hands in hers. Yes, she said, you may court me. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Alara had ever experienced. Aldrich brought her flowers every morning, fresh-cut roses from the hothouse, their petals still beaded with moisture. He arranged candle-lit dinners in the small dining room, just the 2 of them, with no servants hovering and no political guests to entertain. He walked with her through the winter gardens, pointing out the bare branches of the trees and telling her what they would look like in the spring. He told her about Catherine, about the girl he had loved and lost, about the grief that had nearly destroyed him. He spoke of her with tenderness, but also with distance, as though she were a chapter in a book he had finished reading long ago. And Alara told him about her own years of loneliness, about the whispers she had overheard at balls, about the way she had felt herself disappearing, bit by bit, until there was almost nothing left. They talked in the library late into the night, the fire burning low, their voices soft. They talked about their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. They talked about the future they might build together if they could find their way to each other. It was not easy. There were moments of awkwardness, moments of misunderstanding, moments when the old wounds threatened to reopen. But they kept talking. They kept trying. They kept reaching for each other across the distance that had separated them for so long. And slowly, Alara felt something begin to bloom in her chest, something fragile and tentative and terrifying. Hope. The turning point came on a snowy evening in late January. Alara was in the music room, playing the piano. She had not played in years. She had stopped shortly after her marriage, when everything that had once brought her joy had begun to feel hollow. But now she found herself returning to the instrument, her fingers remembering melodies she had thought she had forgotten. Aldrich appeared in the doorway while she was playing. He did not announce himself. He simply stood there listening. When she finished the piece, she looked up and saw him. His expression was strange, haunted, as though he were looking at something he had never seen before. That was beautiful, he said. My mother taught me, Alara said. I used to play every day. I stopped when we married. I am not sure why. I am sorry, Aldrich said. For what? For being the reason you stopped. She shook her head. You were not the reason. I was the reason. I let myself disappear. I let myself become invisible. That was my choice, not yours. No, Aldrich said, crossing the room to stand beside her. It was my fault. I made you feel unwanted. I made you feel as though you did not matter, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to make up for that. Alara looked up at him. The candlelight caught the planes of his face, the strong line of his jaw, the dark eyes that had once seemed so cold and now seemed so full of something she could not name. Why now, she asked. Why did you change? Because you left, he said simply. Because when you walked out that door, I realized that I had taken you for granted in every possible way. I realized that I had been so consumed by my own pain that I had never once considered yours, and I realized that I did not want to live in a world without you in it. Aldrich, I love you, he said. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. I love you, he said again. I think I have loved you for a long time. I was simply too afraid to admit it, too afraid to feel it, too afraid to risk losing someone again. But losing you is the one thing I cannot bear. Alara felt tears sliding down her cheeks. You love me. I love you, he said. I love your strength and your grace and your quiet determination. I love the way you have endured everything I put you through and still found it in yourself to give me another chance. I love the woman you are and the woman you are becoming. I love you, Alara, and I am sorry it took me so long to say it. She rose from the piano bench and faced him. He was so close that she could feel the warmth of him, smell the familiar scent of sandalwood and wood smoke. I loved you for so long, she whispered. Years. I loved you for years, and I thought you would never love me back. I thought I would spend my whole life loving someone who could not bear to look at me. I can bear to look at you now, Aldrich said, and his voice was rough with emotion. I can bear to look at you, and I can bear to love you, and I can bear to spend the rest of my life proving that love to you, if you will let me. Alara reached up and touched his face. His skin was warm beneath her fingers, and he closed his eyes at her touch, as though it were something precious. Yes, she said, I will let you. Spring came to Blackwood Manor. The gardens burst into bloom, and the bare branches that Aldrich had pointed out during their winter walks were now covered in blossoms of pink and white. The air smelled of roses and fresh-cut grass, and the sound of birdsong filled the mornings. Alara walked through the gardens with her husband, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm. They did not speak. They did not need to. The silence between them was no longer the silence of distance. It was the silence of understanding, of peace, of love. Thomas Hayward had written to her once, a brief and kind letter wishing her well. She had replied with gratitude and honesty, telling him that she had found her way back to her husband, that she was happy, that she would always remember his kindness. She did not expect to hear from him again. Her Aunt Marguerite had visited the previous month. She had looked at Aldrich with sharp, assessing eyes, and then she had nodded, satisfied. You have done well, she had told Alara privately. He is a different man than the one you described to me. He is, Alara had agreed, and I am a different woman. Now, walking through the garden with the sun warm on her face, Alara felt a sense of peace she had never known before. It was not the giddy excitement of new love. It was something deeper, something steadier, the quiet certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. What are you thinking about? Aldrich asked. I am thinking about the night of the ball, she said. The night I told you that people talk because you had made me invisible. He winced. I remember. I thought that was the end, Alara said. I thought that was the moment I stopped loving you, but it was not. It was the beginning. It was the moment I started fighting for myself, and it was the moment you started seeing me. I see you now, Aldrich said. I see all of you, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure you know it. Alara smiled and leaned her head against his shoulder. The invisible Duchess was invisible no longer. That evening they sat together in the library as they did most evenings now. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the candles burned low, and outside the windows the spring stars were beginning to appear. Aldrich was reading aloud from a book of poetry, not the one Thomas had given her, but a new one he had bought for her in London. His voice was low and steady, and the words washed over her like water. When he finished the poem, he closed the book and looked at her. Alara, he said, there is something I have been wanting to ask you. What is it? When we married, I told you that I would never love you. I told you that our marriage was one of duty, not affection. I have spent 3 years proving those words true and the last few months proving them false. But I have never formally asked you to be my wife. Not really. Not the way a man should ask a woman he loves. Alara's heart began to beat faster. What are you saying? Aldrich reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. He opened it to reveal a ring. Not the heavy, ornate ring she had worn since their wedding, but something new. A simple band of gold with a single sapphire, the color of the sea at midnight. Alara Vance, he said, and his voice trembled slightly. Will you marry me, not because of duty, not because of politics, but because I love you and I want to spend the rest of my life being the husband you deserve? Tears filled her eyes. We are already married. I know, but I want to marry you again. I want to stand before our friends and our family and God and promise to love you, properly, the way I should have promised the first time. Alara looked at the ring, at the sapphire that caught the firelight, at the man who had once been a stranger and was now the other half of her heart. Yes, she said, yes, I will marry you again, 100 times, as many times as you want. He took her hand and slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as though it had been made for her, as though it had been waiting for her all along. And when he kissed her, gentle and reverent, Alara felt the last of the old wounds finally begin to heal. She had spent years loving a man who could not love her back. She had spent years waiting for something that never came. She had spent years disappearing bit by bit until there was almost nothing left. But she was not disappearing anymore. She was here, she was seen, she was loved. And that was enough, that was everything. The Duke of Blackwood had learned to love, and the Duchess of Blackwood had learned to let herself be loved. It had taken them 3 years of pain and months of healing to find their way to each other, but they had found it. They had found each other. And that was worth every moment of waiting. The second wedding was held in the garden at Blackwood Manor, on a perfect day in early summer. The roses were in full bloom and the air was thick with their scent. The guests stood in rows on the lawn, their silks and satins rustling in the warm breeze. Alara's Aunt Marguerite was there, her sharp eyes bright with tears. The staff of Blackwood Manor lined the edges of the garden, beaming with pride. And at the end of the aisle, beneath an arch of white flowers, stood Aldrich Vance. He was dressed in a simple dark coat, and his dark hair was slightly tousled by the wind. His eyes, those eyes that had once been so cold, were warm now, warm and full of something that made Alara's heart ache with joy. She walked toward him slowly, her hand resting on the arm of the family's oldest friend who had agreed to give her away. Her dress was simple, ivory silk with no train and no veil. She did not need to hide behind lace and ceremony. She wanted him to see her, all of her. When she reached him, Aldrich took her hands in his. "You are beautiful," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion. "You have always been beautiful. I was simply too blind to see it." "And now?" she asked. "Now I see nothing else." The ceremony was short and simple. They spoke their vows beneath the summer sky, their voices steady and sure. They promised to love each other, to honor each other, to see each other, truly see each other for all the days of their lives. When the priest pronounced them married, Aldrich cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. Not the chaste, formal kiss of their first wedding, but a real kiss. A kiss full of promise and passion and love. The guests applauded. The roses swayed in the breeze. And Alara Vance, Duchess of Blackwood, felt her heart overflow with a joy she had never thought possible. She had been invisible once. She had been forgotten. She had been the woman standing alone in the ballroom while everyone pretended not to see her. But she was invisible no longer. She was seen, she was loved, she was home. And that was the greatest gift of all.